Good morning, students. Hope all is well and you're safe. This lecture is for April the 1st or the 2nd, depending on which history class you're in. In our last discussion, we were discussing the events at the very beginning of World War II, and we had ended up discussing the Battle of Britain and the German invasion of the Soviet Union and how it had bogged down. Of course, the Soviets accomplished what they intended to do in that they allowed the Germans to drive deep into their territory, but as a result of that, they had tremendous distances over which they had to ship supplies, and the Russians were able to attack those shipments. The winter was deep with snow and sub-zero temperatures. You will have many German soldiers freeze to death in the trenches waiting to fight the Soviets. Well, the U.S. ceases technically to be a neutral party in the war. The U.S. is going to start a policy called Lend-Lease, and that will include the Soviet Union. So get the picture. During World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union will wind up being allies. And of course, U.S. shipping on the North Atlantic is attacked by German subs. And so Roosevelt, even though we are technically not at war, orders U.S. warships to shoot on sight any German submarines. And still, Americans hoped we were going to be able to avoid an all-out war. Well, during 1940, the U.S. and Japan moved closer to war. Japan, in September of that year, will sign a pact with Germany and Italy. So that technically allows them to be an ally. They announced they're going to take complete control of Indochina. And when they do this, Roosevelt freezes all Japanese assets in the United States and cuts oil exports to Japan. And he also closes the Panama Canal to any Japanese shipping whatsoever. And so the Japanese decide they will conquer Southeast Asia and steal, take, whatever you want to call it, the much needed raw materials that were being cut off by the United States. Of course, then the Great Plan. Yamamoto will know that he could not defeat the U.S. in a long, protracted war, so he literally bets on a first-day fatal attack that will destroy the United States Navy. And so, unsuspectingly, don't know why it was unexpected, should not have been unexpected, but unexpectedly, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese will attack the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. Of the 8 American battleships that were in Pearl Harbor, all were either sunk or disabled, and 11 other ships were destroyed, and the Japanese destroyed 180 American warplanes. The Japanese losses were actually quite minimal. At the same time, the Japanese were assailing military facilities in the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Islands in the Pacific, as well as the British bases in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Malaya. So we're talking about more than just Pearl Harbor. We're talking about literally, hopefully, a one-time knockout punch for all the Allied powers in the Pacific area. Couple of problems. They missed the maintenance facilities and the oil storage tanks in Hawaii. They missed the U.S. aircraft carriers that were out of port that day. And it was a miscalculation because the surprise attack actually aroused Americans in a way that Japan could have never envisioned Americans would be aroused. People were lining up to enlist in the military, and they were ready to take on the Japanese powers. It is said that 16 million Americans will be placed in uniform. And so after the attack on Pearl Harbor, on December 11th, Germany and Italy will declare war on the United States. So on December 18th, Congress passes the War Powers Act, and this actually gave the president some far-ranging authority to organize government agencies and, if necessary, create new ones, to regulate business and industry, and even censor mail and other forms of communication. Adolf Hitler, by the way, apparently was fairly ignorant of America's industrial potential. Now, realize America's still in a depression, but the potential is there. And I will say something here. Never underestimate the determination and the power of the United States. That is a mistake that both Germany and Japan made, and others through history have made. By the end of 1942, so December we enter the war, by the end of the next year, we have exceeded the output of Germany, Japan, and Italy, all our major enemies. In a year, we shift from a depression economy to a war production economy. It is an amazing thing. And a little later, I will give you some statistics of just how much the United States, actually produced. So, Roosevelt literally transforms the American economy into the world's most efficient military machine. And even in the South, we see industry coming into being. There will be cities where ships are made and so on. And so we will have a Revenue Act in 1942 that will raise taxes, and literally it will cover about 45% of the military cost. The government will obviously have to borrow the rest, and it will sell $185 billion, with a B, worth of governmental bonds to pay interest to purchasers. And literally, Americans, average Americans, are going out buying these bonds, helping the country in its war efforts. And of course, like World War I, women rally to industry, and they will help push the country through to victory as a result of their heroic efforts at home. It's quite interesting. A young woman who has had an interest in this is actually working on a World War II memorial in Washington, D.C. to honor the women who supported the country so much during the war. Something that is well past due, but something that will be well deserved to recognize the heroic efforts of Americans, not only on the battlefield, but at the home front. Now, prices will be frozen, but basic goods will be allocated through ration coupons. And so there will be limited amounts of sugar, coffee, gasoline, automobile tires, meats, and things of that nature. Now, going to be criticism, as you can imagine. Going to be a lot of people criticizing the government for the way they're handling things, and those criticisms are going to increase as the difficulties last. But these were things that were necessary to help pay for a Herculean effort in that the United States is now going to wind up fighting a two-front war. It is estimated that more than 6 million women will enter the civilian workforce, as well as nearly 200,000 entering the Women's Army Corps. And the women will even go so far as to form a professional baseball league, while so many of the American men are away supporting the home efforts. More than 500,000 African Americans will leave the South for the better paying jobs in the North. There will be construction of military bases, many of these in the South, and they will be a boom to Southern textile mills to manufacture military uniforms. But the war did not end racism in the United States. Blacks who were hired were often limited to the lower paying jobs, lowest skilled jobs. Throughout the war, African Americans will serve in segregated units still. And they will rally just like others to serve in the military. And they will volunteer in great numbers, but still they will be in segregated units. Now, perhaps one of the most famous will be the some 600 pilots that were trained at Tuskegee Institute, who will later be known as the Red Tails. Their basic mission, and quite honestly, their officers had to fight to get this mission, was to guard American bomber units taking the war to Germany. What occurred so many times, white pilots, quite honestly, when the Germans would send out decoy fighter pilots, they would go chasing after them to get kills, to run up their score, and so on, and they would leave the bombers undefended. The Tuskegee Airmen stayed where they were supposed to stay, number one, and they gained great admiration and respect of the American bomber crews. Now, a lot of times the question comes up, why did they paint the tails of their planes red? That was a simple reason. It was typical American, in your face. Remember eugenics? Remember the Germans were fighting a racial war? Well, to them, African Americans were inferior. And so these red tails wanted the Germans to know that a race of people you think are inferior are shooting you down. And so it was a definite in-your-face German thing. And it spited a lot of Germans. Now, if you watch the movie Red Tails, and it is a reasonably well done movie, you will find that it looks like only a few of those young men actually sacrificed their lives. But if you wait till the end and read the credits, you will see that quite a few of them sacrificed their lives in a tremendous way to help this country win a military victory. Now, to me, one of the most astounding things is Native Americans. Now, we've already discussed how horribly the Native Americans have been treated by the United States, and yet Native Americans will support the war effort. And one group especially will be so very important in the Pacific effort. It will be the Navajo Indians. They have retained their language. And so Navajos will be given the position of radio operators. They can communicate with each other in their native language, and the Japanese had no way of, quote, breaking the code because it wasn't code. Now, these men signed up and they were put in units, and they realized if there was a chance they were going to be captured, that they were to be shot and killed by their own people. And yet, in many respects, they were integral to the success of the United States armies in the Pacific because, as I say, they were not using a code. They were using their own native language. Well, let's talk about civil liberties. There were a lot of Japanese Americans, especially on the west coast of the United States. And there were all kinds of rumors after Pearl Harbor that the Japanese were coming, they were going to invade California and everything else. And so, as a precaution, quote, Japanese Americans are going to be herded up and put in war relocation camps. There's going to be well over 100,000 Japanese Americans that will be so treated. And any Japanese Americans that enlisted in the United States Army were put in Europe. They were not allowed to fight in the Pacific because there was a fear they might turn traitor or whatever. And it will not be until 1983 that the government acknowledges what went on. Okay, so let's talk about the war. With U.S. military aid, ultimately, the Germans will be forced to surrender at Stalingrad. And this actually turns out to be a turning point in the European war as the Soviets begin to move westward. Now, there were some colossal battles fought. In fact, the largest tank battle ever in history will be fought in Russia. But the long supply lines, the bad winter, and everything else is going to give the Russians an advantage. Plus, there's a whole lot of anger. There's a whole lot of desire for revenge. And the Russians have one goal: Berlin. They want Berlin. They actually want Hitler, but they definitely want the city of Berlin. Okay, as we had noted last time, the Germans had landed in North Africa, and they were attempting to hold on to the strategic oil supplies that were there. So in 1942, British and American forces are going to land in Morocco and Algeria on the northwest African coast. And they're going to begin to push the enemy armies back across Libya. Now, quite honestly, early on, the Americans were beaten pretty badly in these early battles. Edmund Rommel was the German commander, and he was probably the premier tank tactical commander in the world. And so he was pretty much defeating the Americans until the Americans were given, and your textbook calls him a brilliant commander, in the person of General George Patton. Now, the one fatal mistake Rommel made was that he wrote a book on tank tactics. Well, Patton is a good general. Patton wants to know his enemy. Patton reads Rommel's book. And he can figure out what Rommel is about to do by the way his formation's set up. And so he will turn the American army in North Africa into a fantastic fighting force. And over 250,000 German and Italians will be ultimately captured, surrendered, and all of North Africa by 1943 will be in Allied control. Now, the battle for the Atlantic will reach its climax as German submarines are sinking British and American vessels faster than they can be replaced. But two things will happen. Number one, the British experts will crack the German naval codes and allow them to steer clear of the submarine webs that they had built. Plus, this will enable them to use long-range planes that are called subchasers. Also, there will be the invention of sonar and radar that will allow the Allied ships to track the ships underwater. And of course, this will be very, very effective not only in the Atlantic, but in the Pacific. In May of 1943 alone, 41 German U-boats will be destroyed. So these new technologies are really great and effective. Okay, in July 43, over 250,000 British and American troops land in Sicily, and they will bring an end to Mussolini's dominance there. And ultimately, they will invade Italy itself, start up into Italy, and Patton will be one of the leaders here. And as he and the British General Montgomery move up, ultimately, Mussolini will be overthrown by his own people, and he will actually be executed by the Italian people, and they switch sides in the war. Now, the bad part about that is we take Italians out of the war, but the Nazis are not about to give up Italy because they know that's a corridor to invade Germany. And so they will stock Italy with their own crack troops, and it will be a long, hard fight all the way across Italy. In June 1944, the U.S. will finally enter the city of Rome. So it's going to take a while. Well, the Germans had bombed Britain, especially London, in the Battle of Britain. And as the Allies began to gain more superiority in the air, the Army Air Force, and notice how I worded that, the Air Force was not separate from the Army at that time, along with the British RAF, will begin to use long-range bombers, and they are going to pound Germany into submission. Now let's realize the British are ready for payback. And so entire cities will be brought to ruin as a result of this. The U.S. will have two major airplanes that they use, the B-17 and the B-24. Now, let's do not get the idea this was easy. A lot of American flight crews are going to be shot down and die. And it is estimated that this air war campaign will actually take over 350,000 German civilian lives. And yet, this was to bring Germany to its knees. Air superiority will be established by 1944, and with this, the United States, along with Britain and France, is going to be ready for the greatest gamble and the most comprehensive military operation in all of history. It'll be known as D-Day. A lot of efforts are going to go into place. You're going to have British decoy troops giving misleading public statements. You're actually going to have the creation of an American army that probably had less than 100 people in it. Most of its vehicles are made out of cardboard, but they are carrying on communications as if they were a part of a future invading army. And this will be put under the command of Patton. And of course, this keeps the Germans off balance because, quite honestly, the Germans expect Patton to lead the invasion. Now, the Nazis are going to expect the invasion at the most narrow point between Britain and France, across the English Channel. But the Allies decide to pull a little stunt on them. They go to the south. And it is estimated that between June and August of 1944, that the Soviet army, as they are moving westward, will kill over 350,000 and capture over 350,000 German soldiers. And you have the Allies beginning to move eastward then after the landings on Normandy. And so they are literally pushing toward each other and pushing the Germans in between them. On July 25th, 1944, and believe me, D-Day was really, really close. If we had not gotten off the beaches, that invasion would have failed. The Germans would have been able to concentrate more forces on the Soviets, and the war effort in Europe might have failed. But ultimately, we will get off the beaches and we will move inland. Now, thankfully, Hitler contributed to the Allied victory. He was having one of his headaches, and so he took a tranquilizer. He did not want to be bothered. And only he could release the reserve panzers, their huge attack tank, and none of his officers wanted to bother him. And so it may be that a headache helped win that particular battle. Now, German resistance in France is tremendous for about the first 10 weeks. They are not going to give up without a major fight. It will be July 25th, before technically the armies break out of Normandy and head east toward Paris. And it will be mid-September, and most of France and Belgium will have been cleared of German troops by then. The Soviet army is moving relentlessly westward, and they are moving along a 1,200-mile front. So again, we're pinching the enemy in between us. Well, in the midst of this, we have an election year, and ultimately, Roosevelt naturally is reelected again. And so by December 1944, with things not going well on either the Eastern or the Western fronts, Hitler decides to try a reckless counterattack. And quite honestly, it came close. It will be called the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler will send reserve tank corps. He will send the SS. He will send everything he's got left into this one last-ditch gamble and counterattack in hoping to stop the eastward movement of the Allies out of France toward Germany. There will be desperate fighting. The city of Bastogne, where the 101 Airborne was, and by the way, they're fighting in the snow, still in their summer uniforms, and they will virtually be surrounded by the Germans, and the Germans will demand their surrender. A thought. As the Battle of the Bulge began, some of the SS troops that were engaged took Allied prisoners, took them into a field, and just shot them down. Just murdered them rather than dealing with them. And of course, this word went throughout the Allied armies. Instead of demoralizing the Americans, it actually did a lot to energize the Americans. And so when the surrender turn comes down, and I've actually seen a photocopy of the actual letter, the German commander sends, I guess, what you would consider fairly gracious terms of surrender. And the American commander puts together a very short letter. The first line, to the German commander. The next line, nuts, the American commander. That's it. And he hands it to the German to take back to his commanding officer. And as they are escorting the German out of their lines, he's trying to figure out, is this good or bad? And one of the American soldiers says, you're going to find out. Well, it is rumored that when Patton heard about this, his statement was, a man that eloquent, we've got to save. And so he picked up his armor division, and this is winter. It's a snowy winter in Europe. And he moves his armor division further, faster, and engages more enemy than has ever been done in all of history. And he reaches Bastogne and breaks the siege. An amazing feat. But again, never underestimate Americans and what they can do and what they might accomplish. And so Hitler's last desperate gamble has failed. And so ultimately, the Allied troops in the West will begin to move into Germany. And as they do, you've got the Soviets pursuing in from the East. And so by early 1945, Nazi Germany was on the verge of defeat. But Hitler would not allow his generals to surrender. He figured if his Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, was going to lose a war, that he was going to let his nation be destroyed in the process. Now, if you did not think he was a madman, surely you believe that now. And so he's not allowing his armies to surrender. The sad thing is, as Germany is about to fall, President Roosevelt succumbs, and he will not live to enjoy the victory celebrations. So the Americans are moving across Western Germany. The Soviets are moving across Eastern Germany. And of course, ultimately, both of them are headed toward Berlin, which will fall on May 2nd, 1945. And on May 7th, Hitler has committed suicide by this time. The Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces will unconditionally surrender. Now, the Soviets, as they entered Berlin, literally had to fight street to street and often against children without any kind of military training, just children that the Germans had thrown weapons into their hands and told them to defend the city. And so this is how utterly desperate Germany had become toward the end of the war. They were killing their own officers if they lost battles. And when a country starts killing its own officers for reasons such as that, all sanity has been lost. But in this process, the Americans and the Soviets came across some things that they thought existed, but they found out they really did. They started coming across Hitler's death and concentration camps, what we call the Holocaust. And of course, as they began to liberate these various camps, it was horrendous, the conditions that they found. Patton, as hardened a general as he was, as used to seeing death and carnage as he was actually sickened by the first concentration camp that he came across. And it was only then found just how extensive Hitler's idea to exterminate Europe's Jews had actually been. And it was a horrendous thing indeed. The U.S. probably knew about the Holocaust as early as 1943, but unfortunately, they were unable to do anything about it until they ultimately invaded and went into Europe. Okay, so that pretty much gets the German warfare. Now, it was started somewhat later because the United States figured their greatest threat was in the Pacific and with Japan. And so Pearl Harbor takes place in December 1941, and the U.S. has suffered a tremendous defeat. So what is the U.S. going to do? And sadly, your textbook doesn't talk about this, and it is a sad thing indeed. A pilot, Colonel Doolittle, goes to the chiefs of staff, including President Roosevelt, with an insane idea. Let's put B-17 bombers on an aircraft carrier, the new ultimate weapon in naval warfare. Now, B-17s were not intended to take off on aircraft carriers, but they figure if they can strip them down, they can make them capable of taking off. If they steer close enough to Japan, they can actually make a route, hit Tokyo with a bombing raid, which the Japanese had bragged would never happen, and make it back to the carriers. And of course, the chiefs of staff think this is insane. And the story is told that Roosevelt was there in his wheelchair, and all these people are putting down Colonel Doolittle and saying this will never work. And so Roosevelt finally begins to try to get up out of his chair. Well, his aide comes, and Roosevelt says, leave him alone. So finally Roosevelt stands, and he looks at his chiefs of staff and says, gentlemen, I'm not supposed to be able to do this. And then he gives Colonel Doolittle permission. Now, basically, it will be the idea of 30 seconds over Tokyo. These bombers will go in with limited everything except some bombs, and they will bomb some industrial sites in Tokyo. It will shock the Japanese people. It will have some effects. Because they were sighted early, they'll actually have to take off early, and most of the planes will wind up crash landing in places in China where most of the Chinese people are going to go to great, great efforts to try to help them. So, first blow back. Minor, but important. A moral blow for the U.S. Then, during the spring of 1942, the U.S. forces will finally have some successes. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, May 7th and 8th, the Japanese fleet will be stopped. So the advance the Japanese have been making since Pearl Harbor will finally come to a halt. Now, Coral Sea is not a victory. It's kind of a strategic draw, but it will at least stop the invasion. And then a month later, Yamamoto decides he's got to take the island of Midway. This is a major American air base, and it must be taken. But unbeknownst to the Japanese, the Americans had broken the code. And so the Americans knew the Japanese were coming. And so 3 American carriers will set up on one side of the island of Midway, and they actually will not be discovered by the Japanese scout planes. And so here will come the 4 carriers that were engaged in the attack on Pearl Harbor. And they will attack the island, unknowingly that the American carriers are there. Now, in the first few attacks, the American planes did horribly. Ineffective equipment, torpedoes that either wouldn't arm or would explode upon arming, and all kinds of bad things happened. But in the end, all 4 carriers will wind up being sunk. The U.S. will have one carrier destroyed. And bless its poor heart, it is the Enterprise. And what will happen, the Japanese fighters will follow some American fighters back and hit Enterprise. It'll be on fire and dead in the water. Well, the crew does a fantastic job. They get the fires out. They actually get the boilers relit. And from the air, Enterprise looks like a viable U.S. carrier. Up close, if a seagull had landed on the landing deck, it would probably fall into the bottom of the ship. But from the air, it looked viable. And so the Japanese, when they return, will think it's a different aircraft carrier and will attack it again. And so Enterprise will draw the attention away from the Wasp and the Hornet, and they will be able to inflict the first major defeat on the Japanese Navy, and Midway then will become the turning point in the war in the Pacific. 2 months later, 19,000 Marines will land on the little island of Guadalcanal. And what the U.S. decides to do in the Pacific is not attack every island they come to. They island hop. They hit strategic islands. And they're hitting islands that they hope they can use to place American aircraft on that give them less range to be able to attack Japan itself. And so they're trying to take these strategic islands. The fighting will last from August to February of the next year. But this will be the Japanese Army's first defeat. Now, the fighting on Guadalcanal was savage, partly because of Japanese religion. Japanese state religion was known as Shinto. It was literally a worship of the state. And to surrender or to be captured was considered an offense to ancestors, an offense to the state. And so the Japanese will fight brutally and extensively to keep from those things happening to them. Also, because of that attitude, they will treat American prisoners of war horrifically. There will be way more of percentage of deaths in Japanese prisoner of war camps than there will be in German prisoner of war camps. And so, first Army defeat. There will be battles then in this leapfrogging strategy. In 1944, U.S. forces will release Guam and Saipan from Japanese control. And Saipan was so very important because it allowed the newest American bomber, the B-29, to be able to reach Japan and then return to that air base. And so this will be a major, major point of departure. And as was being done in Europe, now Japan is being bombed and bombed to its knees. In October, the U.S. will enter the Philippines and liberate it. There will be 4 major sea battles fought around the Philippines from October 23rd to the 26th. They will be known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This will be the largest naval engagement in history, and the defeat for the Japanese Navy will be even worse than the defeat at Midway. But at Leyte Gulf, we have the first of that Shinto belief and philosophy. It is called the kamikaze, the divine wind. These are suicide pilots. They have one job: take an airplane loaded with explosives off and try to fly it into a U.S. vessel to damage or destroy it. And of course, many American lives will be lost as a result of that. As the war grinds on, 30,000 U.S. Marines will land on an island called Iwo Jima. It will take approximately 6 weeks to secure the island, and it will cost over 7,000 American lives. Very, very brutal fighting indeed. In the conquest of Okinawa, we have the largest amphibious, in other words, invasion from the sea to the land of the Pacific War. It will involve a total of over 300,000 troops, and more than 110,000 Japanese will be killed. So it is going to be a very huge operation. Through the summer of 1944, the U.S. continues to bomb Japan, and then they switch. Instead of just using regular bombs, they begin to use incendiary bombs. These set fires. And of course, many Japanese cities were built out of wood, and so in using these kind of bombs, literally entire cities could be reduced to rubble. And still, the Japanese did not plan to surrender. But the U.S. had been working on something quite diligently since the fall of Nazi Germany. Some of the captured German scientists were helping the Americans, and the Americans developed what was called a nuclear bomb. This was unlike anything that had ever been used in American history before. 2 of these were actually developed, and 2 Japanese industrial targets were selected. Now, Truman had the most difficult decision an American president ever had. And he finally will give the order to use the nuclear bombs. And what will cause him to ultimately come to that conclusion is Shinto. He knew if the United States had to invade the island of Japan, that Americans would literally have to fight door to door, street to street, from one end of the island to the other, and thousands upon thousands of Americans and thousands upon thousands of Japanese would be lost, and it would be horrific. It would be horrific. And kind of like our Tennessee hero from World War I, Truman is going to reason that he may save more lives by using these nuclear bombs than he would if he did not. So the first one will be dropped on the city of Hiroshima. It was predicted that about 20,000 people would die. As it turned out, 70,000 people died in that incineration that took place. U.S. demanded a surrender. Nothing happened. So on August 6th, the second bomb will be dropped, and you will have more than 40,000 deaths in the Japanese city of Nagasaki. A new era of warfare had been ushered in. We were now officially in the atomic age. And by the way, a lot of the development of the nuclear bombs took place in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, just outside of Knoxville. These were horrendous things. I mean, both cities are gone. They don't exist. There is in the Smithsonian Institute a lunchbox from a child that lived in Hiroshima. The food that was inside of that lunchbox was carbonized. That's the intensity of those nuclear bombs. Well, after the bombings of Japan, the Soviets decide to declare war on Japan because they just want to be able to get in on the spoils of the war. So finally, on August 14th, 1945, the Japanese emperor accepts the terms of surrender. World War II is over. And thus ended the largest and the most costly war in human history. Over 19 million civilians were dead as a result of the war. The United States suffered far fewer losses than other major countries did. And obviously, American territory, continental North America, escaped the devastation suffered by so many parts of the world. But much of Europe and Asia was in ruins, and millions of people are displaced. So what is going to happen after the war is entire societies are going to be reshaped. International relations are going to be transformed. Now, the United States emerges from the war the most powerful nation in the world. And no longer will the United States entertain an idea of being isolationist. That's overdone, gone, not going to happen anymore. The Soviet Union will emerge from the war as a superpower in itself. And almost as soon as the war is over, the United States and the Soviet Union, that had been allies, that had cooperated together, will suddenly square off against one another in complete distrust and suspicion, and utter in another phase of world history in that we will have what is called the Cold War, that is going to shape the rest of the 20th century. So, what turned the tide? I promised you something, so I'm going to give it to you. Here is some idea of the production of the United States. 2 million trucks, 300,000 warplanes, more than 100,000 tanks, 87,000 warships, 51,000 cargo ships, over 20 million small arms, and 44 million rounds of ammunition. Japan thought they would prostrate the United States. Oh, they learned a bitter lesson. Don't tell Americans it can't be done. And sure, don't attack the United States in an unprovoked manner. Okay, so what happens in the end of the war? Germany is divided up between the French, British, Americans, and the Soviets. And the Soviets lay claim to a string of nations in Eastern Europe, supposedly as a block or a boundary between them and Germany. And believe me, today, right now, 2020, there are Russians who do not like Germans and never will. There are still places you can go in Russia today and see the damage brought about as a result of World War II. And there are people still alive who celebrate their victory in the Great Patriotic War, as they call it. Now, so the Soviets can control these large areas, they ship off to prisons, gulags as they are called, anyone who questioned the new communist governments that are put in place. And the U.S. had no real leverage to stop any of this in Eastern Europe. There was still a huge Soviet army. Now, quite interestingly, Patton thought we ought to continue the war and go on into Moscow. But of course, that didn't happen. So, what are some of the far-flung effects of World War II? Number one, America is not going to be an isolationist country anymore. We are going to be engaged in the greater world. Number two, the war transformed American life because it ended the Great Depression. And quite honestly, as we go into the 1950s, we're going to have a period of unprecedented prosperity. Number three, new technologies and products that were developed by the military, radar, computer, electronics, plastics, jet engines, rockets, atomic energy, all of these things are going to be transferred into the private sector, and all kinds of new consumer products are going to come out of these. Number four, there are going to be new opportunities for women, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and other minorities set in motion by social changes that are brought about as a result of the war. Number five, the expansion of the federal government spurred by the war will continue. Government's going to continue to grow. And number six, the U.S. will assume more global and economic responsibilities. Now, number seven, your textbook would have never given you this one, but I think this is very important. Eisenhower, others attributed the Allied victory in World War II to the grace and providence of God. There are going to be a lot of young American men that at the end of the war, as they return home and they think about the carnage, the destruction, the upheaval in lives, and all the things they saw, especially across Europe, many of those young men, without theological training or whatever, are going to pick up and go back to Europe and start a massive evangelistic effort for the cause of Christ in those Eastern Europe's not going to allow it, but in those Western European war-torn countries. And I find this to be one of the most amazing factors of World War II. These are not trained preachers. These are just young people that see a crying, pressing need. And so they will pick up and go. And thus we end World War II. And we'll pick up when we come back next week, right at this point. Be safe. Take care of yourself.